Today we're looking at Same as Ever by Morgan Housel. This is my third Morgan Housel, I think. I got this for my birthday. This one's from 2023. You can't go wrong with Morgan Housel, actually, can you? He has a brilliant way of putting complex ideas into stories, kind of like a modern Aesop's Fables kind of idea, I think, to some extent. And it ties in really nicely with that idea I'm slightly obsessed with from C.S. Lewis, that we need to be reminded more often than we need to be instructed. So, yeah, always love the chance to have a crack at a Morgan one. And it's quite small, that one. It's a nice, easy, fairly light read. The idea is basically, if there were 1,000 parallel universes, what would be the same across all of them? And the answer is that there is actually quite a bit of stuff that would be, so Morgan says, but it tends to be it's sort of ideas like behaviour and incentives and psychology, that sort of thing. So visually, you see the world, basically everything changes, but the underlying drivers for them quite often tend out to be the same. First up, he talks about you never see big stuff coming, and a good example of that would be COVID or Great Depression to some extent. I guess some people could have worked out that was coming, but it seems mostly it was a bit of a surprise. COVID is a really interesting one, and then to tack on to that as well, actually, it's not particularly in the book, but the idea sort of fleshed out. I was talking to a client the other day about the COVID thing. As if you'd known COVID was coming, it wasn't enough. You also needed to know what happened to the market, because you might have guessed the market was going to take a big dive, which it did, one of the sharpest dives in history in terms of how quick it went. But you wouldn't necessarily have worked out that 4 weeks later was going to be the start of one of the biggest bull runs the market's ever seen. So had you done what would seem the obvious thing of going to cash, you would have lost out. So yeah, I mean, it's not only can you not know it's coming, but you can't know also what the impact is going to be, and it's a really hard thing to try and deal with. He mentions the skiing story again, which I read somewhere else. I think this is the third of his I've read. It's mentioned before, where it's a true story, sadly, where two of his friends when he was younger, they were due to go skiing. He decided at the last minute not to go with them, and they went off the piste or whatever it's called, and died in an avalanche. And he ties this back into the idea that you can make teeny decisions that can have catastrophic impacts, and you just don't get to know when that's going to be, which is a bit sort of depressing to some extent, isn't it? Because you just don't know at what point you're going to do something. You could be paralysed into doing nothing, but also you just don't know what the biggest risks are in terms of what might go wrong. So yeah, a bit of a difficult one to deal with that, but it's worth giving some thought to. He quotes Charlie Munger, who says that the world isn't driven by greed, but it's driven by envy. And then there's the whole idea that envy is just relative greed. And that's really interesting, that, isn't it? Because I mean, if you've got 3 sausages, I want 4. But if you've got 10 sausages, then 4 is going to be a very disappointing situation for me, assuming I was driven in such a fashion. And I think that's a much better way of looking at it, because Charlie Munger says some really interesting thing about incentives. I remember him saying, show me an incentive and I'll show you an outcome. But I think that's as good as that in terms of the driver is relative greed, not actually greed. And it's a very Morgan Housel idea, actually, isn't it? The whole idea of expectations versus reality. He talks about how exceptional achievement tends to go hand in hand with difficult personality traits, and we tend to wish that we could separate the annoying bits from the genius. And he talks about the example of Elon Musk. Regardless of what you think of Elon Musk, I mean, a good example, I guess, is Elon Musk figured out how to get rockets to land themselves back down when NASA couldn't do that, which is amazing, obviously, regardless of whether it's useful or not. Don't know. But obviously he's a very weird guy. But the point Morgan's making there is that you can't separate the weird guy from that. So you can't say, yeah, wow, this is amazing, he's doing this stuff with rockets, but he's a bit of an arsehole, we'd just like to get rid of him, or like him to behave better. What makes him that character is obviously a big part of what makes him able to land spaceships. It's sort of an obvious idea again, isn't it? But I hadn't really thought of it in those terms. He talks about people don't want accuracy and they want certainty. And because this sort of ties to my job, people asking a lot of simple questions, or what they think are simple questions that have really complicated answers. And I had a weird conversation with someone about something like this the other day, and he phones me up. I know nothing about this guy, and he says, should he cash in his $2,500 pension and go to Antigua? I was like, I have no idea. It's like, how? That's a really complicated question, and we can get an answer with an awful lot more information. And the answer might, even in that context, be yes or no, as simple as that. But they ask what they think is a simple question, and it's not. And it's like, what are you, 6 years old? It's just like, life doesn't really work like that. You can't just go in and ask a question like that and expect to get an answer to it. It just doesn't work. It has a very interesting one on the importance of stories, and obviously stories is something that he's quite keen on. And he asks, we should all ask ourselves, who has the right answer but I ignore because they are inarticulate? And what do I believe is true but is actually just good marketing? And on that latter point, I think a lot of this post-truth politics ties into that to some extent. It doesn't matter what's true anymore, it just matters how you present it. And Brexit was a great example of that, wasn't it? If for the Remain camp, it was difficult to make an argument because all you can say is, well, let's keep things as we are, but most people aren't particularly happy with that. And then the Out camp can do lots of marketing and big buses and all sorts of things and make lots of outlandish claims, so have a great story that doesn't really stack up. But it's interesting as well, the idea that what am I ignoring because it doesn't get presented very well, and that's a different. I can't think of an example of that, but I guess that's probably some of the problem because it's buried under inarticulateness and it's difficult to spot. But yeah, probably a good idea to be alert to that sort of thing. He talks about stability is destabilising. It works particularly well in stock market contexts. You have a period of calmness and it will tend to sow the seeds for the next great disaster. And it's that laughable comment from Gordon Brown back in the 90s, I think it was, we've ended boom and bust. Yeah, okay. Yeah, well. Another one that alludes to human nature is he talks about, we insist on knowing where the top is, but the only way to find out is to push too far. I was like, if you're an ascendancy in any sort of field, you just don't know, is that the top or could you double it? And that's just, well, I suppose that's not even human nature. That's actually just the nature of the universe, isn't it? You just don't know where the top is until you're past it. It's a difficult thing to deal with, but of course it then drives to just keep pushing, and you get so many people who stop too early. There was an interesting thing about, I think it was Mark Zuckerberg, years and years and years ago, and people offering him millions for Facebook back in the early days. And you think, what is in that mindset that he didn't take that and now is worth bajillions? But probably 99% of us, if we'd built something that and someone offers millions of pounds for it, we'd have taken it and we'd never have got to the billions. So yeah, it's an interesting idea. He reiterates the point about the gap between reality and expectations and how important that is. Is it the psychology of spending money, whichever one? It's the other Housel review I did. Very much digs into that, and this just sort of mentions it in passing. He has a delightfully positive take on historically nasty events, which is sort of nice. An example he uses is talking about the development in antibiotics in the Second World War, particularly antibiotics, and how potentially that saved more lives since the Second World War than it actually were lost in it. And then that sort of ties into the idea of how we ought to be sort of pretty grateful now for the suffering of the people of the past that we now benefit from. And I know that people argue how terrible it is now, but compared to 1,000 years ago, it's not really people seeing, in general, things anywhere near as bad as that. And so we're very fortunate in that respect. And I guess to some extent that does also give some meaning to suffering. It was said that in the Second World War one of the biggest killers was infection. And we now benefit from all those people who suffered and died there, which gives some meaning to suffering to some extent, which is an interesting idea, albeit it doesn't rule out the fact that there could be meaningless suffering as well. He talks about good news takes time, but bad news tends to occur instantly. And there can be things that thrive for decades and are destroyed in an hour, sort of thing. And talks about reputation and trust and relationships, that sort of thing. It's a deeply unfair aspect to life, isn't it? That's really a problem in all fields. Just things that can only be built in a very long period can be destroyed, and there's no equivalent in the opposite direction. It's a bit bleak, that one, isn't it? More positive, he talks about low probability catastrophes tend to be the result of a sequence of high probability coincidences, which sort of suggests within them we've got the scope to try and prevent them to some extent. And I guess to some extent that's what the corporate world is doing. I've recently rejoined the corporate world after being out for 20 years or whatever it was, and it's absolutely annoying because everything is process and box ticking and all the rest of it, but it's clearly all built to prevent things. But it does get a bit single-minded down that route, I guess. So anything new that might come in and sideswipe it, it's got nothing to do with it. But the idea that they're working towards mitigating all those high probability constant things that could lead to the big catastrophe. That's an interesting idea. Also interesting, it talks about the balance between long-term optimism and short-term pessimism that allows you to survive in business long enough to get to the long term. And that's an interesting one, because you see business owners who are just all positivity, and obviously you need some of that, because otherwise why would you bother? But then if you're too optimistic in the short term, you just end up running into problems and you can't deal with a crisis when it happens. Whereas if you're a bit more pessimistic in the short term whilst balancing with long-term optimism, you helps you to survive long enough to actually make it to the long term. That's an interesting idea. So it's like perfectionism in one area tends to come at the expense of others. And yeah, this has long been a comment of mine in golf, because I'm terrible at golf. I kind of like golf, sort of, a bit, but I'm terrible at it. And I kind of make the excuse that people who are really good at golf, chances are it's at the expense of something else they should have been doing, because it's hard and it takes a lot of work. And if you've put that much work in, by definition, that's time not spent doing something else. So, yeah, I quite like that. Morgan Housel sort of backs that idea up. And finally, he talks about incentives are the most powerful force in the world, and you can get people to justify anything. And again, that ties back to that Charlie Munger idea I mentioned earlier, that show me an incentive and I'll show you an outcome. And I think it also ties up that Jordan Peterson idea that the guards in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany weren't all devils. They were normal people who just wore down and with incentives to conform and just go along with that. And so bizarre, isn't it? But yeah, light-hearted, quite small, worth a go. I say with all of his so far that I've read, really good stuff.